Thanks, everyone. Good luck, Yan.
All right, we'll give it just a minute or two to give folks time to join us. Materials here. Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's live online author event with Greenlight Bookstore, co-presented with Asian American Writers Workshop. I'm Jessica from Greenlight Bookstore, and we are thrilled to host tonight's event with Yen Ge, presenting her new book, Elsewhere Stories. She's going to be talking with Jinwoo Chong, and we'll also be lucky enough to hear from Tran Lee, who's the Senior Programs Coordinator from Asian American Writers Workshop. So to start things off, T, go ahead and take it away.
Everyone, thank you so much, Jessica. AAWW is so honored to be involved in this event with Yen Ge and Jinwoo Chong. We're so excited to celebrate Elsewhere. So excited about this collection for a very long time. I'd like to thank Greenlight for hosting this event. My name is T. I'm the Senior Programs Coordinator at AAWW. My visual description really quickly is I'm wearing a pink tank top and I have very short black hair. Along with being the Senior Programs Coordinator at AAWW, I am the shop steward for the AAWW Union, where we stand union strong with the workers of the Greenlight Bookstore. More about AAWW, we were founded in 1991, and you can find out more about us on social media. Our website, aaww.org, is where you can sign up for our newsletter. We are, again, so excited for this event, and without further ado, I just want to pass it right back to Jessica. Hi.
Thank you so much, T, and we're so grateful to be collaborating with the AAWW on this event. And also to the folks at Simon & Schuster, we're grateful to everyone for coming together to make this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We always appreciate the chance to make space, whether it's in person or online, for conversation and connection. Couple little housekeeping things before we get started. In our Zoom webinar, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, and you can interact with the authors and with each other throughout tonight's event, and we encourage that. The first way to do that is through the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like a speech balloon. I know everyone probably knows all the Zoom stuff by now, but bear with me. Post your comments and thoughts in the chat anytime you want. That's a great way to show your appreciation and interact with fellow attendees. But if you have a specific question that you'd like to have answered in the Q&A portion, please put that question in the Q&A module, which is the icon that looks like two speech balloons. We're going to be pulling questions from the Q&A to be answered in the later part of the program. And very importantly, tonight's featured book, Elsewhere, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. And as thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering a 10% discount off of the featured book. Just enter the coupon code Greenlight Events 10 into the coupon discount section at checkout online. I'll paste that in the chat. You don't have to remember it, but something to keep in mind. You'll definitely want to read this book after hearing the conversation. So let me introduce our featured speakers tonight. Our interviewer is Jinwoo Chong. Jinwoo received an MFA from Columbia University. His short stories have appeared in the Southern Review, Chicago Quarterly Review, and Salamander. He lives in New York, and his debut novel, Flux, is already a favorite of the Greenlight staff, so we're especially thrilled to have him here with us this evening. He'll be speaking with our featured author, Yen Ge. Yen was born in Sichuan, China, and she's a fiction writer in both Chinese and English, and the author of 13 books previously in Chinese, including 5 novels. The first of her Chinese language novels to be translated and released in the US, Strange Beasts of China, was one of the New York Times notable books of the year. Her writing in English has appeared in the New York Times, the Irish Times, and elsewhere, and she has an MFA in creative writing from the University of East Anglia, where she was a recipient of the UEA International Award for 2018 and 2019. She lives in Norwich with her husband and son, so she's in a very different time zone from us, and we're very grateful she could join us virtually this evening. Her new book, Elsewhere, is a highly anticipated new story collection, transposing her dynamic storytelling style onto another linguistic landscape. The book has been praised by critics and fellow authors, including Paul Yoon, who calls it a bewitching collection of stories that will leave you awestruck shaken and wanting to reach for it again and again. So Yan's going to read from the book briefly, and then Jinwoo will join her for conversation, and then we'll take your questions after that. So Yan, please take it away.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. And I've already kind of seen so many familiar names in the attendees list. And hello, friends, and thank you, and Jinwoo, for hosting, for chairing my events. And like I was saying, I owe you drinks. And so I'm just going to read very quickly from this story, which is called Stockholm. I'm going to read from kind of at the beginning of the story. It's when, so story is about a woman writer having had a baby a few months ago. Now she goes to Stockholm for a literary event, and this thing took place after the event. So I'm going to start. The five of us sat around a long table, an unusual distance between one another, and sipped our respective drinks. Anna, one of my co-panelists, was narrating her typical day. H conversed with Jacob, a novelist and his friend, about their trip to Israel next spring. The other panelist, Olivia, who also happens to be H's girlfriend, sat in silence, slowly rotating her martini glass. As the pale liquid undulated, the olive swirled inside. You must go to the library, Anna said. It's the most extraordinary place in Stockholm, in my opinion. I nodded, trying to ignore the pain thrusting across my left breast. I often tell my readers, Anna said, I am Swedish in the sense that the city library is my birthplace in this country. It was in the library I learned the language, and later when I wrote my first novel. The book was a huge success. H swiveled around in his chair to comment. It was shortlisted for the August prize. Then he returned to his conversation with Jacob. I'm very lucky, Anna said. Although I would never be able to write Swedish as finely as some of the great writers here, and occasionally some newspaper will still refer to me as an Armenian writer, but I'm truly grateful. I smiled at Anna and quickly touched the top of my left breast. The damp patch was expanding. Sorry, I need to go to the bathroom, I said, standing up and picking up my tote bag. Oh, good, you brought your pump today, H said. Olivia had to send her back early last night, he announced to the table in general, so she didn't end up flooding Madeline's poetry salon. Nobody told me that Madeline is still running her little parties, Jacob said. How is she? I retreated to the bathroom and shut the door. It was cramped, all walls painted red. Sitting on the toilet, I realized that if I pressed my hands against the walls and feet on the door, I could easily elevate myself from the seat. Instead, I assembled the pump and latched the flange onto my breast. In the low and soothing electric beats, I thought of a perpetual motion machine and then imagined a post-apocalyptic world where Earth was struck by countless asteroids and all the creatures were annihilated, all the lands scorched. The last human alive was a woman who woke up in a deserted cottage without any sustenance at her disposal. Fortunately, this woman was still in her postpartum period, so she found a jar and began to hand express from her engorged breasts. And just like Kevin Costner drinking his filtered urine in Waterworld, this woman pulled through with her rich with protein, enzyme, and antibody breast milk. I returned to the table and people had swapped seats. Olivia and Anna were sitting next to each other, whispering. Come sit with Jacob, H said, waving at me. You must talk to Jacob now that you're in Stockholm. As I slid onto the designated chair, H stood up to get another round. I tossed my bag on the floor and asked Jacob how he'd find the evening so far. Jacob smiled, his mustache impeccably trimmed. Isn't it correct that you were expressing your milk in the bathroom? You'd hope so, I said. Otherwise, I must have been critically constipated. I want to ask you a question if you don't mind. Certainly, I said. H beamed at me from beside the bar and gave me a thumbs up. I'm curious to know what you did with your milk there, Jacob said. Did you dump it or did you drink it? That's me.
Wow. Thank you so much, Yan, for that. I was reading along and I was reading this earlier last week and I read that passage about the woman Surviving on Her Breast Milk. And I wonder if you were going to read that today, and you did. So I'm very happy. I'm so happy about that. First of all, congratulations on this book. It's so incredible. And I feel very lucky to get to talk to you on the actual day that it's published. It must have been super exciting. And yeah, I'm just so excited to talk to you. And I know that you're zooming in. It's 11 p.m. where you are. Is that right?
Yeah, it's 11:40.
Okay.
Nearly
Well,
midnight. I will soon be transforming back to a raccoon. So
as you should. Well, thank you for being up so late to talk with me and
no
all
problem.
of us. So I in preparing some of the questions for today, I did sort of look into your previous career and I Googled everything about you. I studied harder for this than I think some tests in school. But I think the most fascinating thing about Elsewhere for me is that it is your first book written in English. And I wanted to know from you, did you find anything about your process radically different when you were composing in English versus composing in Chinese?
Thank you. That's such a good question. And thank you for all the research. And I will give you an A, regardless of the result of today's event. I suppose I was very, very reluctant actually to decide that I was gonna actually like not only like to live in English, but also to adopt this language as my literary language, maybe as like, you know, in addition to, you know, my original literary language, that's Chinese. I think fundamentally, you know, like to write in a different language is always a lot more than just the changing of language. I think no matter between which languages you're changing from and to, it's always like the challenge is always about like you redefining or you rediscovering your writer's identity, like who you are in this new language, what kind of voice do you have, you know, and to whom are you talking? And I think those are the questions, like generally speaking, for writers who change language, you have that problem. And I think in my case, there's like a second layer or the second fold of this problem of this transition is that I'm changing into English, which is a lingua franca and which carries, you know, this post-colonial history. So I feel it's really important for me to think about what I actually want to do as a writer. As much as I don't want to see it, because I don't want to say it this way, but like, you know, from the periphery, kind of, let's just take the Anglocentric point of view and to kind of taking the language of the colonizer and kind of like, am I going to write into the center? And I think that probably was the most fundamental and most sort of existential crisis, almost like when I was writing in this language, in this like a second and in particular English language. Yeah, and I find it just, and I think there's the process. If you read through the stories, obviously I didn't list it, like they were not like organized in chronological orders in the way, you know, when I wrote them. But when I see the stories, I know like there's this transformation of myself. When I first began, I think I took language, but I also took the literary norms and the literary tradition that came with this language, namely maybe short fiction in the Western tradition. And I think gradually you could see me, or I could see myself being more radicalized and kind of gradually kind of trying to only taking the language, but renegotiate and also subvert all the other things that came with the language, and kind of dividing that, right? The language is actually, it's not, doesn't really determine like the literary tradition, the narrative tradition, and everything that we use to tell stories. So I describe this as my transition from trying to write into an English literature into trying to create a new territory in the literatures in English. And I think that to me is something very interesting, because I think it's kind of discovering me as an English writer, but at the same time, I think it's for me standing from, I don't know, maybe an Anglophone point of view, like having like taken this language, but looking back at my own culture, my own language, my own culture's literary tradition. And I think that for me is a long and deep look, that it really gave me the perspective I didn't have before and made me realize what made Chinese, what made Chinese literature, what made me a writer from this particular language and culture, the writer I am, and that's why I exist in this language. So I think towards the end of it, of this particular journey of writing this book, I feel I'm definitely making that transition of trying to, like, for instance, I talk about this in many, many places. I feel bad for talking about it again, kind of feel I need to pay tax for talking about it now, but it's, oh, sorry, I haven't muted my phone, seriously, sorry. But it's kind of like, I think, briefly speaking, English kind of really builds on this, English fiction really builds on this, largely speaking, builds on this temporal structure that this language, you know, it's predicated on like tenses. So then it has it's like this really rigid, like Aristotelian temporal structure. That is the fictional structure. That is the causal rationalization of the fictional structure. That is the temporal structure. That's the foundation of English fiction. Whereas in Chinese, I think there were like lots of reasons. The characters being more like visually kind of spatial, you know, it kind of, the characters kind of divides the space. That's how the meanings were conveyed. And also the language itself has no tenses. So I feel like in my experience now as a writer in Chinese for many years, I feel Chinese literature is more of a temporal structure. It kind of more or like storytelling, it relies more heavily on a spatial correlation. And in a way, I feel this spatial correlation it could also be seen as like this time of coexistence of all those things kind of coexisting, rather than in this Aristotelian way, it's a time of succession, which is probably more hierarchical, whereas this is a bit ironic, right? To say the Chinese way is maybe more democratic, like the Chinese way of storytelling. It's maybe it's a bit more egalitarian way, because all the events were just kind of placed in places and in correlation with one another, and it's a time of coexistence, or you say it's a spatial correlation. It does not carry this sense of succession, this like causal rationalization. So I think I've spoken too much. This is me, you know, you give me one
No.
question and I just run for 10 minutes. You'll be like, oh yeah, wait.
Yeah.
How about my research?
Oh my gosh, that's fascinating. And I love that you sort of very much cast it in the political sense too, when you speak about post-colonialism and the sort of the history of those languages and how they've kind of co-opted, invaded each other. I didn't ever really think of it that way in terms of translation, and it's amazing to hear. It does make me think, because you are fluent in both languages and have had much of your work before translated into English. Do you find that it's kind of difficult to read English translations of your work and feel that sometimes it wasn't captured as you wanted it, or do you feel that some translations are more successful than others of your work?
That is a really good but also provocative question.
Without naming names, of course.
It's a bit insidious. But no, I think I have a very kind of healthy relationship with all my works translation. Like, you know, obviously, you know, when it goes into a different language that is not English, you are just like completely detached. But when it comes to English, it just, as it happens, you know, I could read the translation, but I feel like I'm still quite removed. Like whenever I read my translation, I kind of really just appreciate it as in its own terms, if that makes sense. Like, especially I think for me, it's such a, I had this book called Strange Beasts of China that came out a couple of years ago, actually by Melville House and in the States. And yeah, so, and when I first read Jeremy's translation, it was translated by Jeremy Tan, I just purely really enjoyed it, because I'd written that book at that point, probably 15 or 16 years ago. So I'd blissfully forgotten, what I wrote. So it's kind of like, it's my husband joke about it to say this is my Tolstoy moment, because allegedly when Tolstoy was very old, he kind of just like pull the book from his bookshelf and then begin to read it. I was like, oh, this is a very good novel. I'm realizing later that was written by himself. So my husband called that my Tolstoy moment. I read it, I was like, oh, this is such an interesting book. So I just like, as just a random reader in English, like I really, really enjoyed that. And I think, but it really shows, this is why but I think reading translation of my own work, or like working, like, kind of when translators ask me questions, and then when we were trying to find like, well, mostly the translators really, I'm like, whenever like there's like a tricky situation where something doesn't seem to be able to convey in English, I would very quickly say I give up, and the translators will kind of persevere. But it really shows me, if anything, I think it's the changing of language so much determines on the changing of readership. And I think that is a much more drastic change than the superficial change, the linguistic superficial change. And I think in a way, that's what got me, like, say, when I got into writing English, and from the start, that was my most fundamental question, because having learned from my translators, I realized the language really is not, it's not the main challenge. The main challenge is the change of the readership, meaning the change of the literary context. You know what I mean? Like if you write a story facing, I don't know, like American readers, and if you say so-and-so walks into, I have no American culture reference. I'm just gonna say this guy walks into JF Chen. But that would imply a certain kind of person, this character, from a certain kind of social class, or kind of like what kind of person would go to, I don't know. So you kind of have, within the same context, every gesture, every like note, like every item you pick for your fiction is loaded with those cultural implications. But then how to translate that when you're kind of being uprooted and supplant that into a different soil, namely a different cultural and literary context. I think that is the fundamental challenge. That's what I learned. I think maybe I was very lucky when I began to write in English. I almost kind of had like a shortcut in the way I never really wasted much time trying to like mystifying the changing of language itself. I kind of really just cut straight, in my opinion, to the chest of this problem, which is really the shift of readership. But I think I did learn that from years of working with translators, from reading their translation of my work and comparing those two.
It is definitely a very special position to be able to switch languages. I don't hear of it often. The one that I think when Scrivener sent this to me, it said in the letter, it spoke about Jumpo Lahiri, who pivoted to writing in Italian and found like new creative energy in that. And what a gift to be able to, move between. It's incredible. I wanted to pivot a little bit into the stories themselves and ask you, and I didn't know that Strange Beasts of China had been written so much earlier, but I guess what I'm wondering is, of the stories, did you find that they were coming, that these were old stories that you had written earlier, or were a lot of them newly written for the collection?
Yeah, I pretty much just wrote this for my MFA.
Oh, that's amazing.
Confession. I suppose Yeah, because like only one of the stories, which is Alexander Whelan, which is the story with the longest title, is called How I Fell in Love with the Well-Documented Life of Alexander Whelan. See, I have to really try to train myself on my breathing technique to be able to say this. So that was written before I did I joined that I got inroads into the MFA program, and then the rest were pretty much done kind of, within like 2 years of my MFA. And then the last story, the novella High, that was done after MFA. So it's kind of, I think they were kind of, aside from Alex Whelan, I think they were pretty much written within like 3 years, 2.5 years, really. Like, so I feel like because of that, although they kind of seem to be quite varied, like, sometimes even stylistically, but they were kind of really speaking about the same chunk of things, because that was just me between 2018 to 2020, I guess. Yeah, but I suppose when I was like sorry.
No, please go ahead.
No, stop me from from slipping into like, I don't know where I'm going, like if you put a coin in me, I'll be like going for like 3 days.
I was going to ask you, I guess, what was your experience putting the stories in order? Like, what did you think about in putting the novella at the end? Was it ever not at the end versus other things?
Yeah, I think it was. So I kind of sent this collection to my agent without the novella. So the final story with the novella is called 9 Stories originally, and when I sent the earlier draft for my agent, it was called 8 Stories. That's where I was. And I sent it to him without the novella, and I was the idea was, I thought, because I personally felt like, like I didn't really have like a concrete plan in the sense of like writing, I don't know, like a serialized short story collection, like you have those collections that were like same captures or like repeated like themes or like repeated scenarios, so kind of like, or taking place in the same town, etc. So this was none of that, obviously. So I feel a bit like uncertain, I guess. But also I think when I was working on those stories, I felt really strongly I need to try loads of things out, because that's the whole point of me abandoning Chinese, aka my long-term partner, and entering this like speed dating scenario, which is immensely exciting. It's like I got to try different guys and women and non-binary while I am now speed dating. I have to do everything. So that was very clear to me. But when I finished all this whole process and then kind of send this manuscript to my agent, I was like, well, I don't know what to do with them. And then I was asking him whether we should kind of trim those kind of an ancient Lingian stories. I kind of feel they belong to different strands. I was like, do you think we should just like, just let go of some of them and then kind of just sort of enhancing a certain kind of theme? And then at that point, he'd read like once, kind of half finished, like my failed story, which was like the beginning of High, and ages ago. And he's like, why don't you finish that story? And I think you could put them together. I was like, no, more work. What are you talking about? Like, I was really like resistant towards that idea of like asking me to put in more work, basically. But he kind of persuaded me. So it took me another 8 months, if not 10 months, to work on and then finish High, the last novella. But I think when that was finished, it felt like the last piece of a jigsaw, and it kind of, I began to see, I really saw this whole collection as like a full picture, albeit being kind of ostensibly different. So then I kind of, and then having that in my mind, High as like the climax, like the ending of this whole kind of meandering of narratives. So I have that as my ending, because I feel that's the thing that would encapsulate every story. so that was there. And then I think I put the stories in the order where we are traveling towards that point. I think each story every story in a way brings about the story right next to it. And that order cannot be changed because there's something that in the previous story would always direct you into the story afterwards. So that is determine the order. But then generally, I think the trajectory is to take you to high, to, like 5th century BC in China but like I think high is you didn't ask me this, but I feel high is such a special thing for me, is because it was ostensibly really off-putting to both me, the author, and also the readers, I guess, unless you're like completely weird, dear reader. In that case, it's fine. Because it's kind of ostensibly it's about the story about Confucius and his disciples, and it took place in like 482 BC. But then I think it is fundamentally, if you really get into it, and for me as well, it is a modern story. It is a political satire, I think, of the world we're in, of like various political bodies. I think for me now, having lived in the UK, I said this again a number of times when I'm here doing interviews, it was literally inspired by PM Questions, this like spectacle on TV every Thursday. And then there was when Boris Johnson was prime minister. And then there was literally a character in this story, one of the Confucian disciples were based on Boris Johnson. So in a sense, it's really, really modern. It's kind of like, I think it's postmodern, obviously, like nowadays, like now, nobody can write a genuine classic story. Any attempt to it's always like a parody of being classic. It's always like a postmodern experiment of like trying to be classic. You can only be the parody of the classic. So I feel that's definitely one of those situations. Yeah, but I kind of I guess I have to thank my agent for forcing me to do that.
It is so interesting to hear you speak about high and the sort of, the period aspects of it that put it in a very sort of richly defined, time period that is no longer, but makes it very modern. I was going to speak to you about, that story, as well as the one When Traveling in Summer, I thought were really, really beautifully rendered in terms of all the details and the sort of the context that you place them in. What is your sort of relationship with like historical research? Do you find yourself doing a lot of it in order to illustrate stories that take place way back when?
Yeah, I did like, thank you, you asked, because I think lots of people thought, because I'm Chinese, I'm naturally like an expert of Confucius and Confucian texts, like analects. I could recite all of that because I'm Chinese. No, like, yes, I knew nothing. I really knew nothing. Like, so yeah, it was like, that was part of the reason why it took me so long, I think, to write those stories. It took me like extensive research, and also, all those texts will be like in classic Chinese, and I actually don't quite like I could, but like, no, it took me ages, and it has to like say When Traveling in the Summer, when it first it came to me, this story, like it was literally brought to me by Madeleine Tian, and she was asking me, and she gave me this page. I'm just trying to find the page here. She gave me this page that is kind of like a project for the magazine Brick, and she was asking if I could translate this page. So this was the page Madeleine sent me, and she was asking me if I could translate this page into English, and they were gonna do a project to get translators from different languages. They would translate from my English translation, and naturally I said yes. But I do not understand a thing about this page. Like, and they were like in very kind of obscure classic Chinese and without punctuations. Like I did not have a clue. So I had to call a friend in China who knew somebody like who are kind of in this Chinese like academy, cultural academy, and then studied like, you know, classic literature or like classic Chinese maybe. And so this person, this friend of a friend, kind of deciphered this text for me and into modern Chinese. And then I kind of, so it's kind of, there's always like, you know what, sometimes I think, I don't know if this ever happens to you, Jinwoo, like, I think in fear that if anybody discovers my Google research records and then expose that online, my, you know, it's like I will be destroyed. I will be destroyed. I will be destroyed completely. If only you knew the amount of the ridiculous things I Googled. Yeah.
I've been there. I've been there all the time. We'll just both have to keep it a secret.
I know.
I wanted to ask you about the title because I know that a lot of collections, the title is one of those stories of the book, and that is not the case with Elsewhere. Can you speak about how you came up with this title or how it came about?
Yeah, I guess my agent bullied it out of me.
Oh, easy
And then,
answer.
again, like, this is like a very, because this, I mentioned it before, like, you know, when I send the story collection now, I said this is called 9 stories. It's not because I was being lazy, because I really tried, but I couldn't find a tutelar story, you know, I couldn't find anything that could kind of encapsulate what's going on with all of those stories. I feel like nothing is right. So I kind of just give this kind of umbrella term, like literally just like 9 stories. And then we start like brainstorming stories. By we, I mean actually me. It's me submitting like different title ideas to my agent and being rejected by him about like 30 times, I say. And then I got like, I think the idea I was probably going with, you know, like a quite popular format of short story collection title, which is like ... and other stories.
Mm-hmm.
So then I was trying to pick a story from here, from the collection, like an actual title of the story, and then to say, and other stories. And then he says, my agent said, like, he didn't like, it's like not a valid rejection, really. Now I think about it, it's just like such a terrible. And he said, I don't like those titles. And so then I developed that into kind of like ... and stories from elsewhere. And so then like, and then he said, no, this is too much of a mouthful. And then I got really upset and I said, how about just call it Elsewhere? I was as if like, I was kind of just like giving up. And he said, oh, I really like this title. I was kind of shocked. But then like, I think once he decided that Elsewhere was going to be the title, and I thought, okay, that's fine, let's just have this title. But like, it really grew on me. And I think about, there's no other better word as far as I could see, and then Elsewhere, that kind of really puts everything together, because I think it's precisely like all the stories, albeit being at different places, like fictionally, but this idea of Elsewhere kind of really traverses through all of the stories, because it's like this duality in this term Elsewhere. And I feel for stories that took place, you know, in the UK or like in the States, it's elsewhere to the characters in the story, because they're quite often from China or from somewhere else, or to the stories like, you know, that took place in China, and that's a story to readers here. It's stories that took place elsewhere, but actually it was like home to the characters there, or maybe they were like a foreign character, like a Westerner in the story, and that's elsewhere to them. I think it's kind of like this constantly switching back and forth of like, where is Elsewhere, and also where is home? Is Elsewhere home? Is home perpetually elsewhere? And I think those are the questions that really is kind of like a strong thread of undercurrents that travel through all those stories. So then in the end, I feel there was no better word, no better title than Elsewhere for this particular kind of quite weird collection. I'm still, like I'm super nervous in a sense. I couldn't, because when they asked you to do the author's questions, and then they asked you to say, could you tell us whom you think would read this book? And I literally said, I wrote down, like, this was many months ago, but I wrote down, like, I don't know. Like, I felt this was such a weird, sorry, I'm not trying to sell my book now. I'm trying to sell my book, but this was such like a weird like bag of like different things. And I just, but I suppose, and if I were saying, I feel like for me, it had to be strange. It had to be different because it was, I was very comfortable in Chinese, like I feel like otherwise, if it's not kind of almost like revoltingly bizarre, I feel it's not worth it for me now, because I think I really like what I do. Like, I think the reason I write is not to make money. It's to try to do things, try to do different things. It's to try to, have the adrenaline, it's to experiment from one to another. It's kind of like constantly having this intrigue going. It's to kind of hop from one place to another.
Mhm.
And so I think because of that, it had to be really strange. But I'm really hoping that there will be like, I don't know, another 30 weirdos in this world that would like this book. I have no idea.
I think it's a really amazing encapsulation of the collection, because so many of your stories deal with place and, being in one versus another, and the way that they've changed and they change people as they move through them. I think it's perfect. And how funny that it was just your very last gasp, like, just call it this. Because it is perfect.
Yeah.
But
in a way, it's kind of like the perfect process of writing any story. Is you go in, you're kind of feeling kind of unsettled or not as confident. You don't know what you want, so you kind of cover yourself with all the ornaments. It's like we go into a story, we kind of like, oh, we have words, adjectives, things, and we want to make it fancy because we don't know what we want. And I think the creative process quite often is not to add, but to strip down. Or the ornamental parts quite often were representations of our fear towards ourselves. You have to kind of strip them down, like layer by layer, towards the end, having this thing that quite often makes you so uncomfortable, but that is the truth of yourself. And that's your artistic representation, I feel, in that sense. Sorry, you're about to say something. I just interjected.
No. I was just listening in awe. I was just, I feel very inspired by everything you say. And you did mention sort of the abandonment of Chinese and the speed dating of English. And I would ask you, for the future, do you think you'll be continuing to write in English?
Yeah, I just finished my Chinese novel, so which was like, I started that actually in 2012 when I was in the States. I was on my way to Vegas for the first time with two girls, and then kind of looking at the desert of Nevada. I was like, oh, this is the story I want to write. That was the Chinese novel. So I kind of began that novel around that time, and then in the middle, like, took this huge break of writing this English book, and then kind of recommenced. Just finished it like a few months ago, actually. So it's kind of I think I am, for the moment, for the time being, like hop in between two languages. And I am going into my English novel. I know you just sold 2 novels. So where are you now, Jinwoo?
Oh, me. Yeah, but I'm boring. I wrote them all in English.
Certainly. No. I'm just like, oh, he's writing 2 more novels. I saw this. I'm very like, I kind of stalk everybody on Twitter. I was like, anyway, so yeah, so what I could see now for me, like, kind of, I never sort of over anticipate, you could really just see the patch that is right in front of you, like, in your journey, I feel, for me now anyway, because nothing ever goes as the plan. So for now, it's kind of like I'm just looking at the English novel, and that is the thing I'm gonna do. What's gonna happen after that, I really don't know, actually. You know, the earth might explode, who knows? There might be no books in the future because it's gonna be on fire all the time.
Yes, what a
Sorry.
very liberating feeling. There might not be anybody to let down with
No.
with what comes next. We were talking about our Google searches. My Google search would probably be all like Yenge interview, Yenge author appearance, Yenge like Chinese translation. It would have been all of that. And in my Googling, I did find that it was in the Irish Times who said that you had first published your first book when you were still a teenager. And I think a really good maybe last question would be, what advice would you have for debut novelist Yenge?
Oh my goodness. I have always felt like I've been really, really lucky to be able to publish my first book when I knew little, you know, and then you didn't know that you are writing a lesser book, a dramatically lesser book. You were a lousy writer. You didn't know any of that. And then you just let it out. And then the damage is done. So you completely was like rid of the baggage of like, oh, I need to make a debut, or it's like the shit is out. So I feel for me, that's my biggest blessing, because I work from project to project, and I have been working, I have been writing for, oh my God, like 21 years now. You could guess my age. But I think if I were gonna give any advice, if I were in the position, is to allow yourself to write bad books. I feel I've seen so many people, like my writer friends or students I work with, would be very relatively easy to walk away from a project thinking this is not the perfect novel, I'm not doing this right, this is not a masterpiece. I feel me like I never give up. I've written some terrible books. I've written some good ones, relatively good ones, but I just continue to write. I think no matter what, I don't give up. I don't give up on my books. And sometimes I knew even in the middle of it, this wouldn't be great, but I always finish them, because I feel like that's just an exercise. It's like a practice. It's like your daily practice. You're like a monk, and this is what you do. And I don't think too much about the result, because I've written possibly the most terrible book of my career when I was 17 years old. When that book came out, that was like the low point. I've hit the rock bottom. So I'm well. So I feel if that's any advice, because I've seen so many of my friends, like writer friends, who are like so talented, so well read, really intellectual, struggling, like producing their first book, or like a finished manuscript, like a first draft, because they ask too much of themselves. Or maybe, I don't know if this was valid, but I feel that was a blessing for me, just to say, sometimes you wrote bad things, sometimes you wrote lesser books. It's okay, keep going.
And because now you have to post everything on social media, and there's so much more pressure. I've certainly felt that pressure in my MFA before I had a book, to hit all the right checkpoints and to do everything the right way the first time.
Yeah.
That pressure shouldn't exist. I mean, it's just a lot of it is very self-imposed and not good.
Yeah. No, yeah. I just wanted to, you mentioned MFA. I just want to say very quickly, I nearly came to Columbia to do their MFA, and I was so determined to come. And then I was seeing my then boyfriend, this a furious Irishman who is now my husband, who did not want to come to New York City and wanted me to move to Ireland with him. At that point, it was like Columbia, MFA, and moving to Ireland. And I moved to Ireland. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, we would have met much earlier. I just thought it's so sweet to have this link, and thank you so much for sharing this thing.
Oh, thank you too. I mean, I walked into the Melville House office I think it was 2021, I had sold my first book to them. And Strange Beasts of China was in a row of books right in the front. And they gave me a copy. The editor, Carl, had said, you have to read this one. And then that was the first time I met him as well. And that was like the only book that he gave me from that day. And so I've known of your work for so long. It's so amazing to talk to you. I feel like we might have some questions. There is one here. Oh, so speaking a little bit more about your research and your research process, was there anything, especially about, for example, Confucius, was there anything that you found surprising in your research about him and his disciples?
I feel my research is completely unreliable because luckily, I'm writing fiction. So I think when I do research, I have you have all the facts, right? I hope I was getting all the facts. And so I look at those facts as if I were an investigating journalist. And then I tweak whatever that doesn't suit my purpose. So I don't really kind of mold the story purely. So if anyone is reading it trying to learn the historic facts of Confucius, you're looking at the wrong book. I suppose, but it was a very enriching experience actually for me to learn all the texts and then to kind of moonlighting very clumsily as the translator, trying to put them into English and to see how it fits, and also through the translation of those things, and to try to find the voice of the characters, because so much of that particular story was about debate, was about them the exegetes and debating on the analects and different interpretations of it, and I thought through doing my research through reading Zixia, my main character, and well, he historically he wrote the great preface of poetry, so then that was the fact I know about him and all those things. And I think it's kind of interesting. It's kind of like when you're when you're trying to build, I don't know, a table, and then the table has already got one leg, so then you're kind of thinking, oh, how do I work around this leg and to make it something different? Or I think that's quite of an interesting experience for me now, because I haven't really written I'd be very reluctant to call this a historic fiction, but it's speculative historic fiction maybe, so that have some kind of basis in the research. But I often if anything, I feel I so respect the nonfiction writers where they just cannot tweak. It's if I write a thing, I need apple, and make apple happen. I was here's an apple. And for them, it's we don't have an apple, we just have to make do.
So much respect for the nonfiction writers.
So much respect, really, so much respect.
I don't think I could ever do it. It's very, oh my gosh. I was going to ask you, I have another question about Stockholm, which is the story that you read from. And what are your feelings about writing about writers and putting in a story, the reality of your own sort of career as a writer, what it's like to have an agent, what it's like to have books out? Was that difficult to do more so than anything else because you are a writer and have that real life inspiration for it, or was it easier?
I think obviously it was more accessible, right? With all the, it's if you're trying to create this fictional narrative, you have all the emotional baselines of how this character would feel. You don't have to put yourself in the character's shoes. You just know that. And I think in that sense, and you have all the materials of what it's like to go to a literary event, what it's like to have somebody in the audience grabbing your hands without asking you, all those small things, you have all the materials. So that's the upside, the plus side. But also at the same time, it's very challenging because now, because every time when you write, you are at a point, you're at a authorial point, and you're trying to move towards the point, the point of view of the implied reader. there's a gap between your perception as the author and the reader's perception. When the story starts, you have 100, the reader has 0, and then you wanted to move there to deliver this to the reader to like merge those two perceptions. But the problem with like this kind of story is that because you have like fully anticipated what's going on, you're so familiar with this perception, you as the author, but also as a fictional character's perception, you couldn't, it's very likely, I think, for me now, in this case, to miscalculate the reader's perception. To kind of, when you're approaching it, I think it's hard to find the reader's baseline, especially emotional baseline, because fundamentally you want them to empathize. But it's kind of like, you feel this is so important to you personally. Would they feel that way? Would a non-writer person be interested? Probably not, right? They're like, well, this is enough. But it kind of anticipating that kind of person who's like so unfamiliar with this world and how to approach that perception, I think it's a much longer journey than a non-writer story. In that sense, I think approaching the reader's perception, the implied reader's perception, that is the challenge in writing, in this case, more of an autobiographical, narrative. And that's the challenge, because you have that there, but like how to move it there, because that's further away than, in a sense.
Do you often, well, I guess the real question would be, would you ever think about writing memoir? And
no,
because
then I cannot invent apples. What am I gonna do? No. I really enjoy writing like fiction, and then I don't know if this happens to you. The worst thing a writer could do to a real life person is not to use this real life person's story, is to use their name. So then I'm quite enjoying having this like ambiguous power. And to not having to face any consequences because everything is fictional.
Oh, yes.
So are you writing a memoir, the reason you're asking?
I would never. I think I'm in the same boat as you. I admire the power of fiction too much. Also, I think I would just make everybody around me angry because they would be upset about how they were portrayed. Certainly my 2 parents would be very upset. However I portrayed them, because they would always have, they don't like when I tell stories about them. So writing a memoir would be difficult.
I think somebody told me that, which I thought it was really true, like as a writer, you need to train your parents. You need to kind of gradually like drip feed them of like all the discomforts. Mm-hmm. And then gradually they kind of just let go. They're like, okay, whatever.
I have definitely noticed that. I have seen that. And I remember, being very afraid to have, my parents read any of my work just because of how personal it was. And I kept thinking like, well, who has a more personal, more intimate look into me than the people who raised me? And so it felt like but it's still a weird thing because I feel that family life and writing life can be very separate in many different ways, and bridging that gap can be scary. There is a question from Cassandra, and it said, Yan, are you working on anything new?
Yes, I'm working on the novel in English, and
the English language novel. Okay.
The English language novel, which is called Hotel Destination. And I'm hoping I will be able to finish it soon, but I don't know, actually. Like, you never know. And it's kind of like, I feel like, I feel it's been going smooth, and it terrifies me. When things are going well, that's when things are go wrong.
Oh yeah.
It's like I need obstacles. So
does your agent like that title? Is the big question.
Seems to be okay with it. Although the other day I met him for my London book event, I was like, I'm thinking about writing this novel in 2 columns. And he kind of just gasped. He literally visibly, he was like, gasped. I was like, what are you talking about? I was like, that'd be so fun. He's like, no. No, I'm not writing the novel in 2 columns. Everybody relax.
Mhm.
Maybe 4
Mhm.
columns.
That would be something very special, I think. 4 columns.
4 columns.
Yes.
Imagine the process of trying to what do you call that? Like to make that into PDF, like when they
Oh,
were
yes. But very formally daring, and I think needs to be done.
you're talking me into this now. You're gonna have to be responsible for this. If it came out in 4 columns,
Yeah, I will take responsibility. I will take
you
the
have to
flag.
personally purchase like a significant amount of copies.
That's okay. I can do that. I'll do it. uh, just okay. I was about to ask you.
I don't want to interrupt. This has been a fantastic conversation. I'm enjoying it so much, but we're at the end of the hour and we have to let Jan go to bed because it's so late there. But thank you guys so very much for this conversation. Thanks to everyone who's attending. You can see in the chat the link to buy this wonderful book and the coupon code to get a little discount when you order. We'll be posting this event to our YouTube channel. So if there's anyone who missed it, you can see it later on. But thank you so much again. Thank you for this story collection and have a great evening. Good night.
Yeah, bye-bye.